Hi, my name is Allison Posey. Thank you for having me get to join your session. I'm going to do a quick section on learning in the brain with a UDL approach. So I have the link here to the slides, and I also have a QR code that you can use if you want to take your phone and swipe. And just to kind of introduce myself again, hi, I'm Allison Posey. I work at CAST, the Center for Applied Special Technology. We're here in Wakefield, Massachusetts. Feel free to be in touch with me at any point using my CAST email address, aposey@cast.org, or on Twitter at Allison A. Posey. So at any point, if you have questions, please, I know you'll reach out to Jennifer, but please also feel free to reach out to me. So our goals for today are to deepen an understanding of learning in the brain, to think about how the UDL guidelines can be used as a tool to design for learner variability. And all along throughout, we're going to try to make sure that we're making connections from the theory to practice. And I realize my video just caught on. So hello, hi. I'm the voice that's been talking here, Allison Posey. Nice to see you all. I do want to make a note that this is obviously a recording and you all hopefully will have access to the slides. So feel free at any point to pause the recording, go back, rewind, listen in a group, listen on your own, put on headphones, do what you need to do. This is about 15 minutes in length for your planning. So I thought I would also invite you all, knowing that these are our goals, to think about learning in the brain, think about UDL as a tool to design for variability, and to think about application to practice, to see what goals you all may have. Does this spark any interest, any questions, anything you've maybe been thinking or wondering about for today? So with that, again, feel free to pause if you need more time. I do want to get started and just share the 5 key ideas that we're going to explore today. And the big question, the driving question we're trying to answer is, what do we mean by learning and what's going on in the brain? And so I'm going to share 5 ideas today. The first is just the incredible importance of thinking about learning as the interaction of an individual in the environment. We're not isolated brains, but our brains are embodied and they're in our environment and they are constantly interacting in that. The second key idea is that there's tremendous variability. Even identical twins have wildly different brains. Even my brain in this same context in a different situation is going to be totally different. So we know now that there aren't set learning styles, that our brain is not fixed. We don't only use 10% of our brain. We're not just right or left brain thinkers. We are using all of our brain and they're unbelievably variable. The third idea we're going to talk about is plasticity, and that's that our brain changes all the time. You can't stop yourself from learning. Individuals are learning all the time in your classrooms. It may not necessarily be what you want them to be learning, but they are learning all the time. I challenge you to try to not learn something for 10 minutes, and it's impossible. We are constantly learning. Our brain is constantly growing and changing. The fourth thing that I'm going to highlight is just the importance of our background experiences. Those background experiences literally drive what we perceive, and at the core of that are emotions. So those are our 5 key ideas for today. And again, just thinking about what your goals might be, something you might want to be thinking about for today, I really do invite you to pause for a moment and think about, what does learning mean for you? And given this brief introduction, what do you want to learn out of this 15-minute session? So I like to start sometimes with this image, and this was an image that was diagrammed in the 17th century, where we actually used to think that a fully formed little human lived inside each individual sperm. And basically, that little miniaturized homunculus, they called it, grew into its adult form. And they thought, learning and the brain and the human was very fixed from birth. And we kind of can chuckle at this now, but I'm going to really push us to step back and try to be very reflective of our teaching practices, to think about how many assumptions we have about what learners can and cannot do in our classrooms. So when you hear that you have a learner with a certain, learning ability or disability that's been diagnosed, we immediately set fixed expectations of what that individual can or cannot do. And one of the amazing things that we've seen about the brain over time is that we humans have this incredibly slow neurodevelopment over time. And this is part of what leads to the tremendous variability in our brains. So basically, the advantage of this slow neurodevelopment is that we're able to really construct brains that are appropriate for the environment in which we live. I mean, that's incredibly adaptive. If I had grown up in an island off the coast of Thailand where we spend a lot of the day diving into the sea to get food, my retinas, the little lens in the back of, the little lens in my eyes, I probably would have learned to control the dilation and constriction of my pupils when diving at deep depths to be able to get my food. I didn't grow up learning how to do that. And so I cannot do that right now. It's not that I can't, it's just that my brain has not been co-constructed in that environment needing to do that skill. So my brain has been constructed over time in my New England environment, or been kind of all up and down the East Coast in this kind of environment. That is what has really helped the construction of my brain in the environment in which I am. And so this is an evolutionary trade-off, right? Giraffes at birth, like within a half hour of birth, are able to stand up and they're able to start running around and they start to forage for food within a day. And it's just very different than humans where, for 6 months, we're carrying around these little infants. And for a long time, we're helping to raise these children. And so the advantage is that our brains are able to really manage complex reasoning. We're able to communicate. We have these unbelievable social networks that we're interacting with all the time. And you can see from these pictures that the gray matter, the actual cells of our brain, aren't fully formed until our 20s. And that's incredibly powerful for us as educators. Whether you teach kindergartners or you're working with young adults, those brains are still rapidly changing. Now that change slows down, but never fully stops. Even as grown adults, I'm in my 40s, I still have over 700 neurons being born every day, and my brain is still flexible and can change, just not quite at the rapid pace that we see, again, all the way through the 20s. So this is exciting, right? To think about this slow neurodevelopment over time, this variability, but still, I think we run the risk of falling back into these old habits of thinking about variability in this old kind of fixed mindset that there are like these little areas, these little nodes of ability or disability. And so this is actually from phonology, where they used to feel the bumps of your skull. This is back in the 17th century as well. And they would feel for different protrusions and be like, ooh, that person has a proclivity for, spirit or respect or sleep, these different things. Fun is even on here, eating. How fun is that? And as we started to learn more and more, we started to get this idea of, okay, there may be little, where there's been brain damage, that's maybe where we're seeing this person has, and you can fill in the blank with a different diagnosis. So here was a guess at what dyslexia was, that it was a part in the left side of the brain. And if you don't have dyslexia, they actually would call that normal, which I would push to say we would never do now. And they, hypothesized about where there were different, again, localized area of activity. And what I'm about to show you will throw that whole idea, turn it upside down for you, because it turns out, and I'm going to turn on this video so you can see it, the brain is there it goes. The brain is so much more interconnected. I'm going to let it play for you again one more time. We'll start it over from 0. Okay, and now you start to have some activity in the back, go to the front, to the back, to the front, and you don't see one small localized area of activity, but instead you start to see this amazing back and forth. And actually what this person is doing is not complex. It's not like higher order math or reading. They are sitting in an fMRI machine where they try to reduce any stimuli, and all they're doing is reading 3 letters, D-O-G. And from reading those 3 letters, you can see just how activated the brain is. And it's on both sides, not just the left side. And I want you to think about how different that is from this old view of thinking about these localized spots of activity. It's so much more exciting. It's so much more dynamic. In fact, you can see this incredible interconnectivity of the brain. So the connectome is working to map out the white matter tracts of the brain. And we can see these tracts can change within days. So one of my favorite studies to talk about is one in which they blindfolded participants in the study. And for 5 days, they didn't have visual stimuli, but they learned to read Braille for hours a day. And in just 5 days, areas of their visual cortex, which tend to be in the back parts of the brain, so all of these networks here, started to remap for touch in just days. So these networks are responding to the interactions that we have with the environment all the time. It's just this wonderful plasticity that we see. And so what we come to understand is that there literally is no average brain. So when we see these brain scans that show these averages, if you actually were to look at each individual subject where there's specific activity, you'll see that the average matches no one. The average matches no one. And the other thing to understand, when you see these images, those are not the areas of activity. Those are showing the areas where there are differences in activity in a controlled setting or in the experimental. So let's say in this example, let's say people were tapping their right finger, just as an example. What they do is they subtract all of the brain activity that's happening to isolate just the tapping of the finger. So these pictures don't show, they don't represent the tremendous variability of our brains. They don't represent all of the activity that we know happens in the brain. They're just showing a little snapshot of one little moment of one little part. So I want to pause for a moment and give you a chance to reflect on what this brain science means for you and how you might start to think about how you might apply some of this brain science in your teaching. For example, how are you really thinking about that interaction of the individual in the environment for their learning? How are you thinking about the variability of your students and not just set labels that may or may not be there? And how are you thinking about the potential plasticity of the brains of your students who are in your classes? So again, you can feel free to pause the video and have discussion, or I'll give you just a few moments here in case you do want to keep rolling. So the last 2 points that I want to make in terms of the brain are, again, I think that we had this old notion of learning where sensory inputs would come into the brain would make connections or not, and then we would have a motor output. Like a perfect example is we see a cup of water, and that message is sent, via our optic nerve to the brain, and the brain then says, oh, pick up that cup of water, and it moves to the muscles, and there's this output that we start to see. And in fact, we found out that it's so much more than this, that our experience literally drives what we perceive. So this is one of my favorite images from brain science. So I'm showing you all like my best stuff that I've got. This is actually what our visual field should look like. So if you look out of your eyes right now, you technically should see all of the blood vessels that are in front of your visual field. They're there, you have blood vessels there, but probably you don't see them. You also, out of each eye, should see a blind spot because where the optic nerve leaves the eye, there are no photoreceptors there. So we literally should see nothing in 2 spots in our entire visual field. It's amazing. But what happens is that's not the case at all. Our brain literally starts to ignore the blood vessels because they're not changing, they have no meaning, just like we stop feeling our clothing or jewelry that we wear for a while. When it doesn't have meaning, we start to ignore it. And we literally fill in what we expect to see there. Our brain anticipates what it thinks should be in that spot and fills it in for us. and we don't have to do any work. In fact, our brain is doing that all the time. And when I start to think of the implications of this brain science for classrooms, it's overwhelming to me, because that means students come to us carrying all the years of experience with them, and it literally drives what they perceive and how they behave in our classrooms. So again, just think about how different this is from this old model of learning. In fact, what we know now is this brain is outwardly sending all sorts of neurons literally to what we're perceiving. It's driving our perception before we even get there. So I think that that's quite amazing, and that really hits on this notion that we feel, therefore we learn. Our emotions literally drive what we perceive, and very compelling brain evidence that individuals who have sustained brain damage to emotion centers, it's their learning that's compromised. So I think the analogy here, this image, let me just explain. We used to think of emotions kind of like this obnoxious kid in the china shop, and it was knocking over cognition. You know, you got to check your emotions at the door because they get in the way of learning. And in fact, what we know now for a fact is that when emotions and emotion networks have been damaged, learning is compromised. Emotions are literally like shelves that hold up our cognitive glassware. They impact what we perceive. In fact, on days when we're feeling more positive, we literally perceive the height of a balcony or the slope of an angle to be different. So our emotions literally drive our perception, what we pay attention to, and how our physiology is responding. So we'll start to respond to certain triggers in the environment as though they're evolutionary tigers in the classroom. So in this great study by Samantha Daly and colleagues, she measured the cortisol in the saliva of a number of her students, these fourth grade students, before they were asked to read aloud in a reading classroom. And what they found is way before students even entered the classroom, students labeled poor readers, the amount of cortisol that was in their saliva was as though they were in the full sympathetic stress response. It's as though, a tiger was in the room and they were fully freaked out. So you again want to think about if their emotions are that high, if their physiology is that activated, what is that doing for their attention? What's that doing for what they're perceiving? And how is that impacting their learning in that classroom environment? So again, these moments come up for all of us. We all know when we feel, quote unquote, tigers in the room, and it shuts our cognition offline. So what can we do? How can we really think about how this brain science applies to our teaching practices? How can we really think deeply about the variability of experiences that our students are coming to us, especially in higher education? And we know emotions are at the core. So how can we design some flexible options so that those emotions are in a positively activated state to be able to do their best learning? And this is where I would argue UDL really comes into play. So this is the really quick 2-minute tour of UDL, because I know that Jennifer is going to really cover this well with you all. So with UDL, the first thing you have to know is the goal. If you don't know the goal, it's like going to the grocery store when you don't know what to shop for. There's just so much stuff on the shelves, you don't even know where to begin. But when you know the goal, for example, is to shop for, a morning tea with your in-laws, you're going to shop very differently than if you're shopping for the hockey team dinner. So knowing the goal is critical for UDL. So in any UDL environment, people know the goal. So let's just say, for example, the goal for today is to learn 26 muscles of the human body. The next thing you can do is start to anticipate your learner variability and think about the barriers that they're going to face in your activity. So let's say to learn the 26 muscles of the human body, your students are attaching rubber band muscles to the skeleton, and they have a worksheet and a book to reference as they're attaching those 26 muscles of the body through rubber bands. And you can already start to think about some of the barriers. Think about where are students going to get stuck? Where do you have to reteach? Where is the learning just not happening? Instead of blaming the student, we're going to start thinking about the design of the environment. And we're going to use UDL as a tool to help us think about some intentional design options that we can incorporate. We can think about options for engagement. How do we want to engage our students? How can we recruit their interest? Why should I care about putting, muscles on a skeleton? We want to help them sustain their effort. When they get to muscle 10, how can we help them keep going? And we want to help them self-regulate. When they get stuck, what are some strategies that they can use to keep going towards that expert learning that we're hoping to get towards? So, sky's the limit for the ideas. Educators have tons of ideas. Maybe you're, making connections to the goal or making some options for choice. Maybe you're offering some collaboration or some authentic, connections to your muscles. Maybe there's some flexibility in the seating and space arrangement. All of these ideas are coming from these little checkpoints of the UDL guidelines. You also want to think about how you're representing the information. How can they perceive it? How can they understand the language and ultimately comprehend the information? So again, this is where we're thinking deeply about, what's the goal? And maybe we could offer summaries or annotate articles or have focus questions or concept map or caption or videos or highlight the key vocabulary with picture images. How can we have supplementary videos? So again, these are ideas that align to these different checkpoints, and sky's the limit for these. This is where you all can work in teams together and just brainstorm a ton of ideas that you already have for providing options for representation. And finally, you want to think about options for how students can show what they know. And this could be an option for them physically to move. It could be an option in how they express and communicate, and options to scaffold their executive functions, how they're setting appropriate goals and monitoring their progress along the way. So again, you want to make sure you know the goal. And this is where assistive technologies can come in. Graphic organizers, checklists, rubrics, answer keys, model examples, ways for them to monitor their progress. All of these ideas, again, align with these different checkpoints. So to put it all together now, if we go back to that just quick little lesson example that students will identify and locate 26 muscles of the body, and right now we're having them place rubber bands of sufficient lengths to represent the different muscles, we can start thinking about, well, wait a minute, what are some authentic ways that we could have them engage in identifying and locating 26 muscles? Maybe it's more through doing an exercise routine to actually build and strengthen those muscles. Maybe it's to help repair or be a masseuse or something like that. We're thinking about options for representing the information. What are different ways that we can show them the 26 muscles we're trying to get them to learn? Through videos, through highlighting key ideas, through flipping through sports magazines and analyzing muscles. Lots of ways we can represent the information. And finally, how can students show what they know? Do they need to place rubber bands on a skeletal model? That's probably not real authentic learning about the muscles. That could be one option, but they could have other options. Maybe they identify them on an online app. Maybe there's an actual model that they can use Velcro and stick them to. Maybe there's a worksheet and they can label. There can be flexible ways that they can show what they know about those 26 muscles. So I know that's quite a simple example, and what we invite you to do is to really start to build out your own strategies. So take these UDL guidelines, fill in your best ideas, your practices, different strategies that you have that align to the UDL guidelines, and then really think deeply about what the learning goal is. You have to know that goal. And then you're going to anticipate the variability. Think about all that variability we talked about at the beginning and the barriers that the learners are going to face as they try to work towards that goal. And then just design a few options. Doesn't have to be a ton. It could just be one. So sometimes I call that a UDL plus one, very affectionately. Design an option or two in the environment for all of your learners, not just some learners, for all of them, and have them align to options for engagement, representation, and action and expression. So that way it's not an ability or disability that's in a student, but we're thinking about flexible options in the design of the environment that all learners can use as they make progress towards our goal. And that should build autonomy and agency in our learners. So that was a whirlwind tour. We deepened, hopefully, understanding of learning in the brain. We explored how the UDL guidelines can be used as a tool to design for this variability. We're thinking about variability in terms of engagement, representation, action, and expression. And we're sharing our strategies and best practices with each other so that we can use them in goal-driven ways in any environment that we're teaching and learning in. So again, I'm Allison Posey. I'm thrilled to have gotten the opportunity to say hi to you all. Please feel free to reach out to me, again, via Twitter at Allison A. Posey, or email Allison or aposey@cas.org, or be in touch with Jennifer to keep in touch, and take great care, and happy teaching and learning.